In the unforgiving heart of the American West, a lone cabin stood against the fury of a world turning white. Inset with the wind screaming like a banshee, a young woman faced the primal terror of childbirth utterly alone. But this was no ordinary birth. As the blizzard raged, destiny delivered not one soul but 3. Miles away, a struggling cowboy, haunted by a past he couldn't outrun, fought the same storm. He didn't know it yet, but his path of redemption led directly to her door, where a battle for survival was about to unfold, proving that the most profound debts aren't paid with coin, but with courage. The first sign of the blizzard wasn't the snow, but the silence. An hour past noon, the ceaseless Montana wind, which had been a constant companion to Abigail Hayes for the past 6 months, simply stopped. The air in her small, isolated cabin grew heavy still and unnaturally cold. The sky visible through the single grimy window pane had turned a bruised, unsettling shade of grey, a colour that promised violence. Abigail, her body swollen and cumbersome with the final days of pregnancy, pressed a hand to the small of her back, a dull ache radiating through her. She was just shy of 20, but the hardships of the frontier and the acute loneliness of her confinement had etched a maturity into her features that belied her years. Her cabin, a single room of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, was a lonely outpost of humanity in a vast, uncaring wilderness. Her nearest neighbor was a day's ride east, and her husband was a ghost gone for supplies 3 weeks ago and swallowed by the horizon. She had been telling herself he was merely delayed. A broken wagon wheel, a lame horse, a better-paying job that kept him in the boomtown of Helena. Any reason was better than the one that festered in the dark corners of her mind that he had simply left, that the reality of a wife and a coming child had been a heavier burden than his love could bear. The first flakes began to fall, then not the gentle meandering sort, but small, hard pellets, driven almost horizontally by a newly risen wind. Within minutes, the world outside her window dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The temperature plummeted. A draught cold as a grave snaked through a gap in the floorboards, and Abigail shivered, pulling her thin wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. She fed another log into the small cast-iron stove, the cabin's only source of heat. The woodpile inside was dwindling. It was a task her husband, Jacob, should have seen to. As the afternoon wore on, the storm intensified into a full-blown blizzard, a white hell, as the old trappers called it. The wind howled with a predatory hunger, rattling the door in its frame, and piling snow in great sloping drifts against the walls. The world shrank to the 4 walls of her cabin. Inside was the flickering lamplight, the radiating heat of the stove, and the frantic heavy beat of her own heart. Outside was a roaring, formless void. Fear, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her resolve. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. It was then that the first real pain struck. It was nothing like the dull ache from before. This was a sharp, vice-like grip that seized her lower belly and stole her breath. She gasped, grabbing the edge of the crude wooden table for support. It lasted for a long moment, and then receded, leaving her trembling, her forehead slick with sweat, despite the cabin's chill. "No," she whispered to the empty room, her voice shaking. "Not now. Please, not now." But the baby, or what she thought was the baby, had its own timetable, one that paid no heed to blizzards or absent husbands. The pains began to come with a brutal regularity, each one a wave of agony that pulled her under, held her down, and then released her, gasping just before the next one crashed over her. She stumbled to the bed, a simple frame stuffed with a straw-ticked mattress. Panic gave way to a primal, desperate focus. The birthing books she had read, the hushed advice from the women back in Ohio, all of it seemed like faint whispers from another lifetime. There were no midwives here, no helping hands, no one to boil water or offer a word of comfort. There was only the screaming wind and the escalating symphony of her own body's torment. She managed to get a pot of snow melting on the stove, her movements clumsy and interrupted by the clenching contractions. She tore strips from a clean linen sheet, her last remaining luxury, from a life left behind. The hours blurred into a haze of pain and effort. Darkness fell, but the blizzard provided its own pale, frantic light, the snow a phosphorescent fury against the window. The fire in the stove was dying. The woodbox was nearly empty. A new, more chilling fear pierced through the fog of her agony. The cold. She could survive the pain, perhaps. But a newborn child could not survive the cold. The fire was life, and it was fading. Forcing herself from the bed between contractions, she staggered to the woodbox, her vision tunneling. Only 2 logs remained. It wasn't enough. It wouldn't last the night. Her gaze fell upon the wooden chair Jacob had built, then the small table. Her mind, sharpened by desperation, began to make a terrible calculation. Furniture memories, the very bones of her small home, would have to be sacrificed to the fire. Another contraction seized her, this one stronger, deeper, more demanding than any before. It brought her to her knees on the cold floorboards. A guttural cry was torn from her throat, swallowed by the roar of the blizzard. It was time. Alone in the heart of the white hell, Abigail Hayes was about to bring a new life into the world, with only the howling wind as her midwife. The world for Abigail had shrunk to the space between one agonizing breath and the next. The storm outside was a distant, roaring echo to the tempest raging within her own body. Time had ceased to have meaning. There was only the ebb and flow of torment, a relentless tide pulling her further and further from the shore of consciousness. She had managed to break the chair Jacob had made, feeding its splintered legs to the ravenous stove. The brief, almost sacrilegious act of destroying one of the few tangible memories of her husband gave her a grim surge of strength. She was a survivor, not a victim. She would burn the whole cabin down for warmth if she had to. Lying on the straw-ticked mattress, her thin nightgown soaked through with sweat, she pushed with a force she didn't know she possessed. A deep, animalistic sound ripped from her throat, a cry of pure, primal effort. The pain was a white-hot, a tearing, splitting agony that she was sure would break her in 2. And then a sudden slick release. A cry. Thin, reedy, but blessedly alive. For a moment, Abigail lay limp, gasping, the world swimming back into focus. It was a boy. A tiny, perfect boy. His skin red and mottled, his face scrunched in protest at the cold air. A wave of love so fierce it was almost painful washed through her, momentarily erasing the exhaustion and the fear. She had done it. She had brought her son into the world. Using one of the linen strips, she clumsily tied off the cord as she'd read her hands shaking violently. She cleaned him as best she could with a damp rag, his small, squirming body a miracle in her arms. She wrapped him in a piece of her wool shawl and tucked him against her chest, his surprising warmth a balm against her own chilled skin. He quieted almost instantly, his tiny mouth rooting for purchase. She had done it. Jacob had a son. But as she lay there, a fragile sense of peace settling over her, her body betrayed her. Just as she thought the ordeal was over, another contraction, sharp and undeniable, seized her womb. A cry of disbelief escaped her lips. It wasn't possible. The afterbirth, yes, but not this. Not another wave of all-consuming pain. It was stronger than before, fiercer, as if her body, having done this once, knew the path and travelled it with a terrible, brutal efficiency. Panic, which had been held at bay by the joy of her son's birth, came flooding back. Something was wrong. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. There was no time to think, only to react. She pushed again, her body a vessel for a will that was not her own. And then, impossibly, another baby slid into the world. Another cry, this one a little weaker, joined the first. A girl. So impossibly small, even smaller than her brother. Abigail stared, her mind reeling in shock. Twins. No one had ever said anything about twins. How could this be? The doctor in St. Louis, who had seen her in the early months, had been a gruff, dismissive man, but surely he would have noticed. The shock gave way to a surge of near hysterical fear. 2 babies. How could she possibly care for 2 babies? Her milk, her warmth, her dwindling supplies. It was all meant for one. She looked from the boy nestled against her to the new shivering girl lying on the mattress. A terrible, frantic energy filled her. She tied and cleaned the second baby with practiced, desperate speed, wrapping her in the last of the clean, dry cloth. She had a worn flannel shirt left behind by Jacob. She tucked the tiny girl alongside her brother, creating a small human bundle against the encroaching cold. The fire in the stove was sputtering again. The last of the chair was gone. Abigail lay her head back, her body. A landscape of ruin. Her mind a whirlwind of impossibility. 2 children. She had borne 2 children alone in a blizzard. The thought was so overwhelming she felt her consciousness begin to fray at the edges, and that is when the 3rd wave of pain hit her. This time she screamed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. It couldn't be. It was a phantom pain, a trick of her exhausted mind. It was death coming for her at last. She was breaking apart. But the pain was real, the pressure undeniable. It was not a phantom. It was another child. This was no longer a miracle. It was a nightmare, a curse. The world had gone mad. Her body was a monstrous, unknowable thing. The very laws of nature seemed to be breaking down in her small, isolated cabin. She had no strength left. The will that had driven her through the first 2 births was gone, shattered by the sheer impossibility of the 3rd. She was going to die here, on this bloody mattress, surrounded by the children she could not save. Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. "Help me," she sobbed, though there was no one to hear. "Somebody, please." "Help me." But there was no help coming. There was only the blizzard and the relentless final demand of her own body. With a last desperate surge born of sheer terror, she gave in to the pain. It was a weak, pitiful effort compared to the others. But it was enough. The 3rd baby, the smallest of them all, was born into the cold silence of her mother's despair. It didn't cry. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and Abigail's own ragged, sobbing breaths. The baby, another girl, lay still and pale, deathly still. Something inside Abigail broke. No. After all this, no. Ignoring the fire, the cold, The agony that consumed her body, she gathered the tiny limp form. She was so small, a fragile doll. Abigail put her mouth over the baby's mouth and nose and breathed a tiny puff of air. Once, twice. Then she rubbed the baby's chest with her thumb, the motion clumsy, frantic. "Come on," she whispered, her voice hoarse, broken. "Live. Please. Live." A tiny, shuddering gasp, a weak, mewling cry as fragile as a newborn kitten's. It was the most beautiful sound Abigail had ever heard. She had done it. A boy and 2 girls. Triplets. The enormity of it finally crashed down upon her. She lay amidst the evidence of their birth, a trinity of new, desperately fragile lives dependent on her. The fire was nearly out. The cold was a physical presence in the room, a predator circling its prey. She had no more cloth to wrap the 3rd baby, in no more strength to break the furniture. She gathered her 3 infants, tucking the 3rd one under her own chin, sharing her last vestiges of body heat. She looked at their 3 small, perfect faces, their eyes squeezed shut against the harsh reality of the world they had entered. A profound, crushing wave of love and terror washed over her. She had brought them into this world, and now she was going to watch them die. As the last ember in the stove winked out, and the true killing cold of the Montana night began to seep into the cabin, Abigail Hayes closed her eyes and held her children, waiting for the end. Thatcher Stone was no stranger to ghosts. They rode with him by day and shared his campfire by night. The ghost of his wife Mary, taken by cholera 2 years prior. The ghost of his infant son, who had followed his mother just a week later. And the ghost of the man he used to be, a man with a home, a future, and a reason to wake in the morning. Now he was just a drifter, a struggling single cowboy, if one were being charitable. In truth, he was a man running from the silence of his empty life, chasing horizons in the hope that one of them might look different from the last. His only possessions were the sturdy gelding beneath him, the worn saddle, the Winchester rifle in its scabbard, and a profound, bone-deep weariness. He'd been pushing his horse Atlas hard, trying to reach the shelter of the Wolf Creek Pass before the storm hit. He'd read the sky, seen the signs, but had underestimated its speed and its savagery. Now he was caught in the thick of it, a ghost himself in a world of swirling white. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The cold was a physical blade cutting through his thick canvas coat and wool union suit, stealing the breath from his lungs and encrusting his beard with ice. Atlas, a beast of immense heart, stumbled his head low. "Easy, boy," Thatcher murmured, his words whipped away by the wind. Just a little further, but further to where he was lost, disoriented. The trail was gone, buried under a rapidly deepening shroud of snow. To stop was to die. To keep going was to risk walking in circles until they both collapsed from exhaustion. He was a capable man, a man who knew the wilderness. But this blizzard was a different kind of beast, a living, breathing entity of pure malice. He was beginning to accept the grim finality of his situation when Atlas suddenly stopped lifting his head and pricking his ears. The horse snorted, a plume of steam erupting from his nostrils. "What is it, boy?" Thatcher strained his eyes, peering into the blinding chaos. There was nothing but the hypnotic dance of snow. He dismounted, his legs stiff and numb, sinking to his knees in the deep powder. He trusted his horse more than he trusted his own senses right now. He took a few steps forward, leading Atlas by the reins, his body braced against the gale. And then he smelled it, faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Wood smoke. Hope, an emotion he hadn't truly felt in 2 years, flared in his chest. It was a foolish hope it could be a forest fire, though that was unlikely in this deluge. More likely it was a trapper's camp, or a prospector's lean-to, or, God willing, a cabin. He tethered Atlas to a half-buried scrub pine, giving the horse's neck a reassuring pat. "I'll be back for you, boy. Don't you worry." Following the scent, he pushed forward on foot, a hunched figure against the storm's fury. It was a grueling, desperate struggle. Every step was a battle. The smoke scent would vanish, stolen by the wind, only to return a moment later, drawing him on. He was operating on pure instinct, now a primal need for shelter. He nearly walked right into it. A dark shape loomed out of the white chaos, the wall of a cabin. It was small, crude, and looked half-buried, as if it were sinking into the snow. There was no light in the window, and the life-giving smoke he had followed had dwindled to nothing. A cold dread replaced the flare of hope. Had he found a tomb instead of a shelter? He hammered on the door, his frozen knuckles barely making a sound against the thick wood. "Hello in there. Anyone home?" His voice was a raw croak swallowed by the wind. There was no answer. He tried the latch. It was unlocked. With a grunt of effort, he shoved the door open, breaking the seal of snow that had drifted against it. A wave of air, shockingly colder than the air outside, rushed to meet him. The cabin was dark, still, and held the profound chill of death. The fire in the stove was dead, its iron belly cold to the touch. He was too late. Whoever was here had frozen. Still, it was shelter. He could get a fire going, wait out the storm. It was a grim thought sharing a space with the dead, but it was better than freezing himself. He fumbled in his coat for the small tin of matches he always carried. He struck one, the tiny flame sputtering to life, a fragile beacon in the oppressive dark. He held it aloft, his eyes slowly adjusting. The first thing he saw was the bed. A figure lay upon it, a mass of blankets, and what looked like a woman's long, tangled hair. He took a step closer, his heart heavy with a grim pity. Then the match burned his fingers, and he dropped it, plunging the room back into darkness. He lit another. This time, he looked more closely. And the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't one figure. The blanket moved, and from beneath it came a sound. Not a word, but a tiny, mewling cry, thin and impossibly weak. Thatcher froze the match held between his numb fingers. He stared, uncomprehending. He moved the flame closer. There on the bed, cocooned against the still form of the woman, were babies. Not one, but two, no, 3 tiny red-faced infants bundled in a pathetic collection of rags. The woman, her face pale as death and streaked with dirt and frozen tears, seemed unconscious or worse. For a long moment, Thatcher Stone stood there, paralyzed by a shock so profound it dwarfed the cold, the storm, and the ghosts of his own past. He had stumbled out of a blizzard and into a scene from a fever dream. He had come seeking shelter from death and had found it waiting. But he had also found life. 3 of the smallest, most vulnerable lives he had ever seen. The match went out, but the image was burned into his mind. The woman's pale face, the 3 tiny, helpless forms, the dead, cold silence of the cabin. The ghosts of his wife and son whispered in his ear. Run. This was not his concern. This was a place of death and sorrow. He could take what supplies he could find, get the fire going for himself, and leave when the storm broke. To get involved was madness. He was a drifter, not a savior. But then another of the babies let out a thin, wavering cry. It was a sound that cut through the frozen layers of his grief and apathy. It was the sound of a life that was not yet lost, a life that was fighting. Thatcher Stone, the man who was running from everything, found himself unable to take another step back. He stood in the doorway of the dark, frozen cabin, caught between the ghost of the man he was and the impossible demand of the man he might have to become. He took a deep breath, the frigid air searing his lungs, and stepped inside, closing the door on the howling storm behind him. The first imperative was fire. Without it, everything else was a moot point. Thatcher worked with a swift, desperate efficiency that belied his near-frozen state. He found the woodbox empty as he'd expected. His eyes lit on the remains of the broken chair, then the small table. Without a moment's hesitation, he drew the hunting knife from his belt and began hacking at one of the table legs. The wood was solid pine, and it took precious minutes of grunting effort to pry it loose. As he worked, he cast glances towards the bed. The woman hadn't moved. He couldn't tell if she was breathing. The babies were stirring their weak cries, a constant goading reminder of the seconds ticking by. He shaved tinder from the dry inner wood of the table leg, arranged it carefully in the stove's belly, and struck a match. The flame caught. He fed it splinters, then larger pieces, his heart pounding in time with the crackle of the nascent fire. Slowly, miraculously, warmth began to bleed back into the oppressive cold of the cabin. Only then did he turn his full attention to the bed. He lit the oil lamp on the table, its steady glow pushing back the shadows. He approached with a trepidation he hadn't felt since the day he'd faced a grizzly over a deer carcass. He was more comfortable with the raw violence of the wild than with this scene of domestic tragedy. He reached out a calloused, trembling hand and touched the woman's neck, searching for a pulse. It was there. Thready weak, but there. Her skin was icy cold. She was alive, but only just. The babies were a tangle of limbs and rags. He gently, awkwardly tried to assess them. They were so small, he was afraid his rough hands would break them. 2 girls and a boy, he realized, his mind still struggling to process the fact of them. Their skin had a bluish tinge from the cold, but they were breathing, their tiny chests rising and falling. One of them, the smallest girl, was wrapped in nothing but a man's flannel shirt. He knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the blizzard that they were all on the brink of death. "All right, Thatcher," he muttered to himself, his voice a low growl. "Time to earn your keep." He stripped off his outer coat, the canvas stiff with ice, and laid it aside. He began to work his movements, becoming more sure, more purposeful. He found a large pot, filled it with snow, and set it on the stove to melt. Warmth, water, and food. The holy trinity of survival. He tended to the mother first. He peeled back the damp, cold rags she was swaddled in, and covered her with his own dry bedroll, a thick wool blanket that was his most prized possession. He chafed her hands and feet, trying to force circulation back into them. She moaned softly, a flicker of life in the depths of her unconsciousness. Her name, he'd learn later, was Abigail, but for now she was just the woman. Then came the task that truly terrified him, the infants. He had held his own son only a handful of times before he was gone. He was clumsy, inept. Using the warm water from the stove and a strip of torn linen, he began to clean them one by one. He worked on the floor close to the fire, his large frame hunched over the impossibly small bodies. He was as gentle as he knew how to be, his brow furrowed in concentration. He found a small crate in the corner, and lining it with the remnants of the woman's shawl and his own spare shirt, created a makeshift bassinet. He placed it by the stove, a pocket of warmth in the cold cabin. One by one, he placed the cleaned, re-wrapped babies inside. Faith, Hope, and Charity. He thought the names coming to him unbidden a prayer in the face of impossible odds. The cabin was slowly transforming from a tomb to a nursery. The air was warm, thick with the smell of wet wool wood smoke and hot water. The only problem was food. There was no milk, no way to feed them, and the mother was still unconscious. He rummaged through the cabin's meager supplies: a half-empty sack of flour, some beans, salt, a little coffee. Nothing for a newborn. He found a small tin of sweetened condensed milk, a rare treat on the frontier, likely saved for a special occasion. It was a godsend. Watering it down, he dipped the corner of a clean rag in the mixture and gently touched it to the lips of the strongest baby, the boy. The infant, guided by an instinct as old as time, began to suckle feebly on the rag. Thatcher felt a lump form in his throat. He repeated the process with the two girls. It was a slow, painstaking process, but they were eating. They were fighting. Hours passed. He worked without rest, a man possessed. He fed the fire, fed the babies, checked on the woman. He brought his horse Atlas to the sheltered lee of the cabin, covering him with a spare blanket. He settled into a rhythm, the sheer overwhelming need of the situation, pushing aside his own exhaustion, his own grief. The ghosts were silent for once. They had no place here in this room, so fiercely, stubbornly full of life. Sometime before dawn, as the blizzard continued its relentless assault, the woman on the bed stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. They were blue, clouded with confusion and fever. They darted around the warm, lamp-lit cabin before finally landing on him. Fear flared in her eyes, a raw, primal terror. She tried to sit up, a weak cry escaping her lips. Who are you? My babies. Where are my babies? Thatcher moved slowly, keeping his hands open and visible. Easy now, ma'am. Easy. Name's Thatcher Stone. I found you. The storm. My babies, she cried, her voice cracking with panic. They're right here, he said, softly, gesturing with his head toward the crate by the fire. They're safe. They're warm. Her eyes followed his gesture. She saw the crate, saw the gentle movement from within. Her expression shifted from terror to disbelief, and then to a cautious, fragile hope. She looked back at him, her gaze searching his face, taking in his rough beard, his weary eyes, the lines of hardship etched around his mouth. You saved them, she whispered, her voice barely audible. We're saving each other, I reckon, he said gruffly, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her voice. Now you just rest. You've been through one hell of a fight. He offered her a cup of the warm, sweetened water. She drank it greedily, her hands shaking so much he had to hold the cup for her. A fragile alliance was formed in that moment, an unspoken pact between two strangers bound together by a shared catastrophe, and the three small lives crying softly by the fire. The blizzard still raged, their supplies were perilously low, and the future was a terrifying unknown. But for the first time in a long time for both of them, they were not alone. The blizzard held them captive for 3 more days. It was a lifetime. The world outside remained a howling white void, sealing them in the small cabin as if it were a ship lost at sea. The routine Thatcher had established on that first night became the rhythm of their survival. Time was measured in feedings, in the adding of wood to the fire. and in the slow, gradual return of strength to Abigail's frail body. They had sacrificed the rest of the table and a small bookshelf to the stove. The cabin was becoming barer, stripped down to its essential elements: a bed, a stove, and the makeshift bassinet that held their 3 precious, noisy charges. Abigail was a quiet patient, her eyes following Thatcher's every move. The initial fear she'd felt had been replaced by a deep, weary gratitude that she seemed too exhausted to voice. She watched him handle her children with an awkward tenderness that tugged at her heart. This large, rough-looking man, with his calloused hands and quiet demeanor, would patiently spend 20 minutes coaxing a few drops of watered-down milk into the mouth of the smallest girl, whom he'd unofficially named Charity. He'd named the others too. The boy was Abel, and the stronger girl was Hope. Abigail, too weak to protest, found she liked the names. They spoke little at first, their conversations limited to the practicalities of their situation. The water's warm. Hope is crying again. I'll break up the last of the shelf. But in the long, quiet hours when the babies were sleeping, and the only sound was the wind and the crackling fire, the silence began to fill with unspoken questions. On the 3rd day, Abigail felt strong enough to sit up on her own, propped against the wall. She was holding Abel, watching Thatcher carefully measure out a portion of flour to make a thin gruel. "You never said what you were doing out in this storm," she said, her voice stronger than it had been. Thatcher didn't look up from his task. "Wasn't in it by choice. Was heading for the Wolf Creek Pass. Storm had other ideas." "You have people there?" she asked, her tone gentle. He was quiet for a long moment. "I used to," he said finally, his voice flat. He offered no more, and Abigail didn't press. She understood the language of loss. It was a dialect spoken widely on the frontier. Later that evening, after they had eaten their meager meal of gruel, it was his turn. "Your husband," he began, then stopped, unsure how to phrase the question. "You said he went for supplies." Abigail's gaze dropped to the sleeping face of her son. "Jacob." "Yes." "He's been gone a long time for a simple supply run," Thatcher stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. She had been holding this truth in for so long, a toxic secret festering in her heart. In the strange intimacy of their confinement with this man, who had saved her and her children without question, the secret demanded to be released. "He's not coming back," she whispered the words, tasting like ash. "He didn't know about them." She nodded toward the crate. But he knew one was on the way. It was too much for him. The responsibility, the hardship. She looked up, her blue eyes meeting Thatcher's dark ones. "He didn't abandon me, Mr. Stone. He fled me." The confession hung in the air between them. Thatcher just nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He had seen men like that. Men whose dreams of adventure and freedom crumbled when faced with the stark reality of family and obligation. But that's not the whole story. Abigail continued, her voice gaining a harder edge. "We didn't just come out here on a whim. We were running. Running from what? From my father," she said. "His name is Silas Blackwood." Thatcher, who had been stirring the embers in the stove, froze. His hand stopped moving. He slowly turned his head to look at her, a strange, guarded expression on his face. He recognized the name. Of course he recognized the name. It was a name that had haunted his own past, a ghost he thought he'd left 100 miles behind him. "Silas Blackwood," he repeated, his voice a low rumble. "The cattle baron from the Judith Basin. You know him?" Abigail asked, surprised. "I know of him," Thatcher said evasively. turning his attention back to the fire. His mind was racing. Of all the cabins in all the vastness of Montana, he had to stumble into this one. "He's a very wealthy man," Abigail explained, unaware of the turmoil she had just unleashed in him. "And a very cruel one. He owns judges, sheriffs. People say he owns the whole territory. I was his only child. He wanted me to marry a business partner of his, a man 3 times my age, with a reputation for brutality. It was a merger, not a marriage." She clutched Abel tighter. "Jacob was a hand on my father's ranch. We fell in love. It was foolish, I know. A fantasy. When my father found out I was pregnant, he was enraged. He told me he would see the baby disposed of, and that he would lock me away until I came to my senses. He said no bastard child would ever lay claim to the Blackwood name." "So you ran," Thatcher finished for her. "We ran," she corrected, a flicker of loyalty to her absent husband still present. "Jacob scraped together what money he had, and we fled in the night. We came here to this God-forsaken place because we thought no one would ever find us. We thought we could be free." Her voice broke. "It seems we were wrong." Thatcher was silent. His own connection to Silas Blackwood was a dark chapter he had tried to bury. He had worked for Blackwood for a season 2 years ago, before Mary and the baby had died. He'd been a foreman respected for his skill with horses and men. But he had quit abruptly, leaving without even collecting his last month's pay. He had seen things on that ranch. He'd seen Blackwood's casual cruelty, seen him order a man beaten half to death over a misplaced brand. He'd seen the fear in everyone's eyes. Most damningly, he had witnessed Blackwood's men hang a homesteader who had refused to sell his land, a murder disguised as frontier justice, a secret Thatcher had carried ever since. He had run from Blackwood's darkness, just as Abigail had, and now that darkness had found them both in this tiny, snowbound cabin. Abigail believed she was fleeing a disapproving father. Thatcher knew better. Silas Blackwood was not a man who let things go. He wasn't just disapproving. He was possessive. He wouldn't be searching for his daughter out of fatherly concern. He would be hunting what he considered his property. And if he found her with 3 new heirs he had explicitly forbidden. Thatcher looked at Abigail, her face pale in the lamplight, and then at the 3 sleeping infants. He had stumbled into more than just a snowstorm. He had stumbled into the heart of a blood feud, a drama of power, wealth, and cruelty. His path to redemption had just taken a very dangerous, very deadly turn. The debt he owed was no longer just to his own past, but to the fragile family he had inadvertently sworn to protect. The blizzard broke on the 5th day. It did not end with grace, but rather collapsed in on itself, the winds dying to a mournful sigh, the snowfall thinning to a light, apologetic flurry. The sun, when it finally appeared, was a pale, watery disk in a washed-out sky, illuminating a world transformed. The landscape was a vast, rolling ocean of white, beautiful and deadly, the drifts sculpted into fantastic shapes, burying fences and creek beds alike. The silence was as profound as the storm's fury had been. Inside the cabin, the change was palpable. The breaking of the storm meant the end of their strange, suspended existence. The world, with all its dangers and demands, was waiting for them just outside the door. Thatcher stood in the doorway, gazing out at the new world. The air was clean and sharp, so cold it felt brittle. "It's over," he said the words, feeling inadequate. Abigail, now strong enough to walk for short periods, came to stand beside him, wrapping her thin shawl tighter. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice laced with a new anxiety. The storm had been a known enemy. What lay beyond the snow was not. "First thing I need to hunt," Thatcher said, his tone practical. "Our flour is almost gone. We need meat. You and the little ones need proper food." And then he hesitated, his gaze fixed on the distant snow-capped mountains. "And then we need to move. We can't stay here, Abigail." "Because of my father," she stated. It wasn't a question. "Because of Silas Blackwood," he confirmed, his voice grim. "This place, it's the first place he'd look. A remote coin off the beaten path. It's exactly the kind of place a desperate man would take his daughter to hide." He looked at her. "Your Jacob, he wasn't as clever as he thought he was." A flicker of pain crossed her face at the mention of her husband, but she didn't defend him. The reality of her abandonment had settled in cold and hard as the frozen ground beneath their feet. Later that day, Thatcher took his Winchester and a pair of crude snowshoes he'd fashioned from sapling branches and rawhide cord. He returned hours later, dragging a small doe behind him, a welcome sight that promised sustenance for days to come. As he was skinning the animal, a task he performed with a hunter's detached expertise, his eyes kept scanning the horizon. He was watchful, uneasy. The end of the storm had broken their sanctuary's seal. They were exposed. His uneasiness proved prophetic. 2 days later, as a fragile sense of normalcy was beginning to take root in the cabin, the smell of roasting venison replacing the scent of desperation. Thatcher saw it. He was on the small rise behind the cabin, chopping more wood from a fallen pine, when he spotted a dark speck on the vast expanse of white to the east. It was moving. He stopped chopping his body, going still. He watched for a long minute as the speck grew larger, resolving itself into the unmistakable shape of a rider on a horse. It was too far to make out details, but the rider was moving with purpose, following the line of the frozen creek bed, a direct path to the cabin. A cold knot of dread formed in Thatcher's stomach. It couldn't be a random trapper. No one would be traveling this way unless they had a specific destination. He threw the axe down and hurried back to the cabin, his movements urgent. Abigail was inside, humming softly to Charity, who was fretful. "Abigail," he said, his voice low and tight. "We have a visitor." She looked up, the humming stopping abruptly. She saw the look on his face and her own went pale. "My father." "I don't know," he said, striding to his saddlebags and pulling out his Colt revolver. He checked the cylinder, the metallic click sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "But we're not going to wait to find out. Get the children ready. Wrap them up as warm as you can. All the blankets. We're leaving. Now!" Panic seized her. "Leaving? But where will we go? We can't travel in this snow with 3 infants. It's better than being a sitting duck." He snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. He softened it immediately. "Abigail, listen to me. If that's who I think it is, he's not coming here to talk. Blackwood doesn't negotiate, he takes." He remembered the hanging, the casual way Blackwood had watched a man's life be extinguished. He remembered the fear. Blackwood wasn't just a cruel father, he was a predator. "You knew him better than you said," Abigail whispered, her hands shaking as she began bundling the babies. "You worked for him, didn't you?" Thatcher shoved the Colt into his belt. "I did. For a season. I saw enough to know that I wanted no part of his business." He looked her directly in the eye, the truth of his own past finally coming due. "I saw him have a man killed, Abigail, a homesteader who wouldn't sell his land. I saw it, And I did nothing. I just packed my gear and rode away like a coward. I've been running from that ever since. The confession hung between them, a stark and ugly thing. So his flight wasn't just from grief. It was from shame. This debt, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The one I've been trying to outrun. It's not about money. It's about that man I watched die. It's about looking the other way when evil was being done. He looked from her to the bundled infants in the crate. Maybe this is my chance to finally pay it. The rider was closer now, close enough for Thatcher to see the horse was a fine-looking black stallion, a signature of the Blackwood Ranch. There was no doubt left. "There's no time to run," he said, his decision made. He took the heavy timber bar for the door and settled it into its iron brackets. He won't be expecting a fight. He'll be expecting a scared girl and a broken man. He's not going to find them. He turned to Abigail. Her face was a mask of terror, but her hands were steady as she finished wrapping her children. There was a new resolve in her eyes, a reflection of the steel in his own. "Get in the corner away from the door and the window," he commanded. "Keep the children quiet if you can, and no matter what you hear, you do not open this door." Thatcher Stone. The ghost who had drifted into their lives took up his position beside the single window, his Winchester rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He was no longer running. The devil had come to collect his due, but Thatcher was about to make him pay a price he never anticipated. The long overdue debt of his conscience was about to be settled in blood and fire. The rider did not approach with caution. He rode as if he owned the very snow beneath his horse's hooves, an arrogance that was a signature of Silas Blackwood and the men who worked for him. As he drew closer, Thatcher recognized him. Not Blackwood himself, the Baron rarely dirtied his own hands, but his top enforcer, a ruthless man named Cormac. Cormac was a grim-faced gunslick, with eyes as dead as a winter snake, the same man who had adjusted the homesteader's noose with a bored expression. Cormac reined in his black stallion 20 yards from the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He noted Thatcher's horse, the tracks, the faint curl of smoke from the stovepipe. A flicker of annoyance crossed his features. He had expected an empty, frozen tomb, or at most a single terrified girl. "Abigail," Cormac's voice was a harsh bark that cut through the cold air. "Your father sent me. He's a forgiving man. He wants you home. Come out now and there'll be no trouble." Inside, Abigail flinched, pulling her children closer. Thatcher held up a hand, signaling for her to remain silent. He stayed hidden just to the side of the window. "I know you're in there," Cormac shouted, his patience already wearing thin. "Saw the horse. Don't make this difficult." Silence. The only answer was the whisper of the wind over the snow. Cormac dismounted his movements, stiff with cold and irritation. He tethered his horse and began to walk towards the door, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered pistol. He was expecting submission. He was expecting fear. "I'm not asking again, girl," he growled as he reached the door. He tried the latch. Finding it barred, he snarled in frustration and banged his fist against the wood. "Open this door!" "That's far enough, Cormac." Thatcher's voice came from the window, low and steady as a rock. Cormac froze. He squinted, trying to peer into the dark interior. "Who the hell is that Stone Thatcher Stone, I'll be damned? Thought you ran off with your tail between your legs." "I'm still here," Thatcher said, "and you're not welcome. Turn around and ride away." A slow, ugly smile spread across Cormac's face. "Well now, this complicates things. Blackwood wants the girl. He didn't say anything about wanting you alive. The children, he was very clear about them. An inheritance he has no intention of honoring. The threat was clear, cold, and absolute. He didn't want the children. He was here to erase a problem. They're not his to claim. Thatcher said, his knuckles white on the stock of his Winchester. They're hers, and mine to protect. The words hung in the air. Mine to protect. In that moment, they became true. He wasn't just a drifter, a helper. He was their guardian. He was in every way that mattered a father. Cormac laughed a short, humorless bark. You couldn't even protect your own family, Stone. What makes you think you can protect his? The cruel words struck Thatcher like a physical blow, a calculated strike at the heart of his old wound. For a second, the ghost of his past self, the grieving, broken man, rose within him. But then he glanced back at Abigail, her face terrified but resolute, her arms wrapped around 3 tiny, precious lives. And the ghost died forever. This is your last chance, Cormac, Thatcher said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. Ride. Cormac's smile vanished. His hand dropped to his pistol. Blackwood pays well. In a single fluid motion, he drew his gun. But Thatcher was ready. He wasn't waiting for the shot. He had made that mistake once before by standing by and doing nothing. Never again. He fired the Winchester through the window. The explosion of the rifle inside the small cabin was deafening. Glass shattered. The bullet struck Cormac square in the chest, throwing him backward off the porch and into a snowdrift. He landed with a heavy final thud, a dark stain spreading rapidly across the pristine white. The silence that followed was more profound than anything that had come before. It was the silence of a choice made, a debt paid. Thatcher stood for a long moment, the rifle smoking in his hands, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the body in the snow, then back at Abigail. She was staring at him, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning, overwhelming relief. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of fear. He lowered the rifle and unbarred the door. The cold air rushed in clean and sharp. He stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching in the snow. He did not look at Cormac's body again. He looked east, back the way the rider had come. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Blackwood would send more men. But something had shifted. The fear was gone, replaced by a hard, cold certainty. Abigail came to the doorway holding Abel. "Thatcher!" He turned to her. He saw the future in her eyes, not an easy future, but a shared one. A future of struggle, of fighting, of protecting the small, precious family they had forged in the heart of a blizzard. "Get our things," Thatcher Stone said, his voice filled with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. "We're heading west. There's good land in the Oregon Valley. Land a man can defend. Land where we can raise a family." He was no longer a ghost running from his past. He was a father, standing his ground, ready to build a future. That single shot in the snow was not an end, but a beginning. Thatcher, Abigail, and their 3 small miracles. Abel, Hope, and Charity vanished into the vastness of the West. They didn't find an easy life, but they found one that was theirs. The ghost of Thatcher's past was laid to rest, redeemed not by running, but by turning to face the storm head-on. The debt he owed was paid in full by the fierce, unwavering love of a father. Their story is a powerful testament to the fact that family isn't always the one you are born into, but the one you are willing to fight and even die for. It reminds us that even in the harshest of winters, the most unexpected seeds of hope can and will find a way to grow. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story of survival and redemption. If their journey moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and subscribe for more tales from the heart of the Wild West.